Well, I want to welcome everybody on behalf of my department, ECLT, English and Lit, and then Arabic and Islamic Civilizations. I'm Steve Salaita, I'm the chair of ECLT. And we're here this afternoon to present the Nazik Award, which will be presented every 2 years to the best MA thesis from ARIC and ECLT. So it's an award that's jointly shared through two departments. The award came about through the efforts of Professor Yaccoub, who has worked tirelessly to create opportunities for recognition for AUC students. Professor Yaccoub was able to establish the award in consultation with Nazik's son, Dr. Mahbouba, who recently donated his mother's archives to the AUC library. I want to say a few words about the poet for whom the award is named. Nazik is an iconic figure in modern Arabic poetry and poetics. She was a phenomenal woman who changed the map of Arabic poetry, innovated a new style of verse, and wrote a seminal book defending the new poetics and its affinity with the historically marginalized Arab poetry genres. She was in her 20s when she felt grief over the cholera pandemic in Egypt and wrote a poem entitled Cholera that challenged 14 centuries of strict meters, ushering what has come to be known as free verse. While conservatives, including her father, were shocked, younger writers felt it was an innovative style that befits modern concerns and motifs. Nazik triggered a poetic revolution and complemented it with progressive writing on women. Her collected works have been published in 4 volumes by the Egyptian Supreme Council of Culture. Nazik was brought up in a family of poets and continued her university studies in Baghdad and at Princeton and Wisconsin universities in comparative literature. She taught in Iraq and Kuwait and retired in Egypt, where she died and was buried. The significance of Nazik in Arabic literature can only be compared to that of Virginia Woolf in English literature or Sylvia Plath in American literature. Nazik's son, Mahbouba, who was a Cairo resident, inherited a collection of his mother's manuscripts, which will be a great addition to the AUC Rare Books Library. The collection of unpublished writing includes 38 booklets of diaries, over 1,000 pages, about 150 letters, a novella of about 200 pages, a short story for children, and miscellaneous photographs. This constitutes rich material for research, publications, and translations once digitized and classified. We're grateful and incredibly lucky that Dr. Barad chose AUC to enshrine his mother's work. We're here to celebrate Nazik al-Malaika's legacy and Dr. Mahbouba's generosity in addition to the innovative research of our graduate students. The winner of the inaugural Nazik al-Malaika Award is Michael Yaccoub from ECLT for his 2025 thesis, The Communal Lyric, Poetry in Devotional and Oppressed Communities, from which he will share an excerpt momentarily. Before I turn the floor over to Michael, I'd like to note that the selection committee was deeply impressed with the breadth and creativity of his research. About the communal lyric, Professor Martin Mora, its director, has this to say. The strengths of Michael's thesis include the levels of care and meticulousness with which he posed questions that are fundamental to the lyric as form, the intellectual effort and diligence he put into answering them, and the skillfulness with which he integrated this theoretical inquiry with often highly insightful close readings of individual poems. I also think that the project is well researched and very well written, and not least because of the ways in which it brings together Western and Arab Arabic theoretical texts and poems, exemplary in its comparative scope. All in all, I think the project went significantly beyond what is expected at the MA level. And so now it gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce this year's winner, who's going to be sharing excerpts of his research with us, Michael.
So I think while we can wait for this to work properly, there are a few thank yous that I have to give at the beginning. First, I would like to thank you, send a huge thank you to the Nazik and Malaika family and to Professor Yaccoub for setting up this award. I'd also like to thank the award judging committee for the recognition. It makes me quite happy to see that someone took the pains to read the whole thing. The monstrous thing. I'm also incredibly grateful for my supervisor, Professor Martin, for being a lighthouse that guided me through the storm, my thesis committee, Professor Yaccoub, whom I deeply wished could be with us here today. I'd like to thank her for her endless love, care and support that have engulfed me since I joined AUC. Also love to thank Professor Tahiyya Abdel Nasser for being so considerate, so careful, for showing me with care and for her invaluable comments to the thesis that resulted into this thing. Also love to thank all my professors. We have Professor Melanie here, Professor Steve and Professor Hala, Professor Adam, for all the enlightening discussions that we've had, either in the project or the thesis or during our classes, and for all their support. I'd also like to thank the Sasakawa Foundation for the fellowship. I was a silent fellow here at AUC, and they funded my studies throughout the 2 years. And I'd like to take this opportunity to say that sustaining fellowships is the key to sustaining academic excellence and research output. So thanks to the Sasakawa Foundation, and I'd also like to give a huge thank you to Ms. Salma Serri from the graduate office again for her invaluable support throughout the journey. I'd like to thank my family, Dr. Nader, Dr. Nader, and my brother David, for all the love, the support. I would have never been able to do this without them. My friends, again, the amount of support I've had throughout the process. Some of them literally call me every day to check on my progress to make sure that I finish on time, so thanks for that. Finally, I'd like to thank God and the prayers that have miraculously kept me going, even at times when I couldn't anymore. Now, without further ado, my thesis. So my thesis is entitled The Communal Lyric, Poetry in Devotional and Oppressed Communities. This might first, and righteously so, raise some questions on how devotional poetry and poetry of the oppressed can be compared. To answer this, and since this is the inaugural round of the Nazik and Malaika Award, I would like to quote from Nazik herself, who wrote a collection entitled To Prayer and Revolution. And in its introduction, she explains, revolution is intricately connected to prayer. For the person who prays to God, a full-dimension prayer is the person who knows true refusal and revolution against everything that might insult human perfection. Nay, but rather, poetry to me is revolution itself, as I have expressed in the following lines. I'll read them in Arabic and provide a translation. متى نصلي إن صلاتنا انفجار صلاتنا ستطلع النهار تسلح العزل تعلي راية الثوار صلاتنا ستشعل الإعصار ستزرع السلاح والزنبقة في القفار تحول اليأس إلى انتصار صلاتنا ستنقل الجدب إلى الاخضرار وتطعم الصغار فاكهة الصمود والإصرار. When shall we pray? Our prayer is an explosion. Our prayer shall raise the slumbering morn, arm the armless, raise the banners. Our prayer shall ignite the storm, plant weapons and lilies in the barren land, and transform despair into triumph. Our prayers shall turn the arid green into the youngest it shall feed, the fruit of persistence and resilience. Prayer and revolution are intricately connected because they share a common essence, namely that they are liturgical events. They are practiced communally. My thesis is an attempt to investigate how poetry too can share in this essence, how a poem can be communal, not because it represents a community, which Nazik was critical of, but rather how a poem invites an interpersonal relationship with the audience by the very way it is written and structured as a poem. Moreover, my thesis is also an attempt to bring comparative insight into the current Western debates regarding the nature and importance of poetry, not only as an aesthetic object, but also as a form of public social discourse. So, to fully understand this, we need to briefly look at how poetry has been viewed in the West, and often in our region as well, for roughly the past 100 years. Obviously, this is super simplified, superficial simplification, I'm sorry, but yeah. When we think of poetry or a poet, we sometimes fall into imagining the stock image of a poet moulting lonely through as a cloud, isolated, introspective, in solitude, looking at people, but rarely addressing them, or at best, addressing them as in a prophecy. However, recent research has argued that this is quite a recent view of poetry that only emerged with Romanticism in the early 20th century critical schools. Some, like Jonathan Culler, decided to bring back older models of lyric that view it as a kind of speech that tries to affect people, to move them, to persuade them, to do something rather than simply to mean something. In this view, poetry is more akin to rhetoric than it is to other genres of literature, for example, a novel. Nonetheless, because Culler is working from within the Western tradition of literature, which is founded on drama more than it is on poetry, he takes great pains to build his argument. Yet, what he needs to painstakingly build in that tradition is rather intuitive in our tradition of Arabic poetry, hence the importance of my comparative approach. Through my research, I created a dialogue between the recent trends in Western lyric studies and classical Arabic poetics. I particularly compared between Culler's model of lyric, a speech that performs something, and the Arabic theory of takhil, roughly translated as make-believe. I focus on the work of Ibn Hazm al-Qartajani because his theory of poetics is thoroughly explained and well-rounded. I do not want to bore you with the theoretical details, but I would like to focus on one particular quote from al-Qartajani, which forms the cornerstone of my thesis. Like Culler, al-Qartajani views poetry as a mode of discourse that aims to affect people. For a poem to achieve this function, al-Qartajani argues that it is necessary, and here's the quote, that souls firmly give credence to the idea that poetry is an arbiter and creditor that demands from noble souls that they respond to its claims. In the original Arabic, والاستعداد الثاني هو أن تكون النفوس معتقدة في الشعر أنه حكم وأنه غريم يتقاضى النفوس الكريمة الإجابة إلى مقتضاه. I think the word response, al-ijaba, is particularly important here. Poetry demands a response, not appreciation. More importantly, that the poem demands something means that the poem positions the reader or listener in relation to the claims it makes, In a sense, we can say that it establishes a relationship with the audience, and in my thesis, I argue that by analyzing how a poem is written, we can identify the kind of relationship it attempts to establish, and therefore the kind of action it attempts to do. I identify two kinds of possible relationships between poems and audiences, which are apprenticeship and acknowledgement, and I dedicate a chapter of comparative analysis to each of them. In my chapter on devotional communities, I analyze how some poems can function as models of instruction in faith, not didactically, but by either offering an example to be followed, or by inviting the listener to participate in the devotional act the poem is performed. In other words, these poems position the listener as an apprentice in devotion. To show this, I began by comparatively analyzing the formal features of a set of psalms and the Hilat, which are Islamic supplications, which are lyric or lyric-like texts that are still practiced liturgically in our communities to this day. I do so to understand how and why they are used liturgically. I then compared these devotional poems, I then compared the Psalms and the Hilat to devotional poems by two 17th century English poets, George Herbert and John Donne, as well as Busiri's Burda, or the Mantle Ode, a poem in praise of Prophet Muhammad. To give one example, devotional lyrics sometimes employ self-address as a rhetorical tool to indirectly instruct the audience. Now, notice these lines. جهادك نفس فيه الدواء. In your self-struggle, O soul, lies the remedy. This comes from Jihad. Praise the Lord, my soul, all my inmost being, praise his holy name. Psalm 103. Awake, sad heart, thy Saviour comes, and with him mirth. George Herbert. O my black soul, yet grace, if thou repent, thou canst not lack. John Donne. يا نفس لا تقنطي من زلة عظمت. O my soul, do not despair of pardon for a sin, however great. Again, Busiri. Now we can easily argue that these lines are poets speaking to themselves introspectively. However, once we begin to understand how poems can have a communal potential, we realize that they are simultaneously directed to other members of the community listening to them, and anyone willing to partake in the poem's claims as an apprentice. So basically, they address themselves. Whenever I read one of these poems, I'd be addressing myself to indirectly address everyone listening to me in their position. So, oh my soul, in your self-struggle lies there. I say anyone because these poems are what I call open invitation. They do not explicitly demarcate or name a particular community. If you accept the poem's claims, you are welcome to be apprenticed by it. However, this is not always the case. Sometimes poems need to position the listener in the position of the other, to look at the poem from the outside, to understand it, but to never assume its subject position. In other words, to acknowledge the experience of the poem, but not to identify with it. This is particularly relevant in poems of oppressive communities, which I argue function on two levels. For members of the oppressive community, they offer a model or an example for apprenticeship similar to the devotional poems, but for others who do not belong to this community, they demand acknowledgement. They position them as an other to look at that experience, not identify with it, and to acknowledge that experience. Obviously, this is the basic response. Acknowledgement as a word is the basic response, which can then manifest itself in anti-oppression movements like solidarity and shared resistance. To show this, I comparatively analyze 5 different poems by 5 different poets from 4 different oppressive communities. So we have Claude Mackay from the US, African Americans, to reflect on racial oppression in the US, Dennis Brutus and Cleora Petsey, Gositsili, for the racial and colonial oppression in South African apartheid, Ivan Boland, colonial oppression during the Irish famine, and Mahmoud Darwish, colonial oppression under the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Now, what all these poems have in common is that first, they are structured as arguments with thesis and antithesis. And through this, they don't simply offer an example to be identified with, but they are rhetorically addressed to another, convincing the listener of an argument and explaining something that is not already known, but should be acknowledged. Second, all these poems have explicit references to their communities and or their oppressors, that actively demarcate them, making them what I call restricted, demarcated communal lyrics, drawing a line between who we are and who the other is. Now, notice these examples. But I am bound with you in your mean graves, O black men, simple slaves or ruthless slaves, like I, black men. And I have laughed, disdaining those who banned inquiry and movement, delighting in the test of wills when doomed by Saracen arrest. Saracen is a word used to name the apartheid police in South Africa. There's no place here for the inexact. There's only time for this merciless inventory. Their death together in the winter of 1847. So that particular date, that particular year was the worst year of the Irish famine. I want to sing a song of love for the woman who blasted the Boers. Again, Boers is the word used for South African police, apartheid police. سأكتب جملة أغلى من الشهداء والقبل فلسطينية كانت ولم تزل. I shall write a line more precious than the martyrs and the kisses, Palestinian she was and still is. Now, we cannot readily partake in the experiences expressed in these poems because no amount of empathy can replicate the reality of their suffering. However, the poems implicate us ethically by confronting us and demanding that we position ourselves in relation to this suffering. Each time we listen to a poem of the oppressed, we are implicitly asked, what will you do? What will you do to stop this oppression? Now, to conclude, I would like to discuss one last recent example of the communal lyric which shows both apprenticeship and acknowledgement. The poem that went viral during the genocide in Gaza, If I Must Die, by Professor Rifat Al-Arir, who was killed by the Israeli occupation. If I must die, you must live to tell my story. You and I are sitting here in this room, quite protected from the death the speaker must die. I personally find it difficult to identify with this poem, knowing full well that there are Palestinians continuously being bombed and are in the literal threat of death each day. If I must die. So, a Palestinian might readily take the words to be their own, to be apprenticed by the poem. If I must die, they might say. But I, standing here, I am implicated in the you position of the poem. The poem ethically confronts me to tell their story, to acknowledge it, to stand in solidarity, and to figure out what I can do to end this oppression. So, my thesis was an attempt to provide a comparative understanding of poetry that better suits our reality in the region and provide answers to what we believe in and are concerned with. Nazik al-Malaika once wrote an essay entitled A Letter to a Young Arab Poet, in which she said, أنت إنسان شاعر مكانك بين الناس على طريق العمل والهدف والحياة. أنت إنسان شاعر مكانك بين الناس على طريق العمل والهدف والحياة. You are a human poet. Your place is amongst the people, on the road of work, purpose, and life. The communal lyric is a poem that remains amongst the people and believes in work, purpose, and life. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your work. I wanted to ask a more practical question about your selection of these 5 poems. Because I'm on the other side of the thesis process, just starting to confront like the massive selection of text. And I'm curious about your process. I'm sure you read so much before you came to this selection of these 5.
So, I'm not entirely sure I'm the best one to give advice on this because, right before, so I mean, I think 2 or 3 weeks before submitting my thesis, I was still figuring out poems should I use, and I was looking for poems. But here's how the process went. So there's something that I didn't mention in the presentation, but all of these are love poems. And this is kind of an extension of some work that I did during one of our classes with Professor Martin on love poetry. I was guided thematically So, first of all, I knew that I wanted to find poems about oppression. So I started to look at potential areas of oppression, potential, or actually, I targeted some historical moments that I knew would produce these kind of poems. Again, I was also very restricted by either Arabic or English because my analysis is close reading, so I had to be able to understand the language or the poem in its original language. So when you do English, there's basically not so many oppressions, colonial, except with Ireland and South Africa, that produces, except of course there are African poetry, right, and everything in English, not colonialism, but these are the two major kind of points. And then obviously the racial oppression with the US. So I looked at this, I started reading these poems, and again, I was looking from the perspective of love poetry because I was guided thematically by a question, which is, should we write love poetry at times of oppression or not? Because this kind of reflects the idea of poetry as a whole. If you think that poetry is only aesthetic, it's about the beauty, it's about the emotional feelings that you have and whatnot, then it doesn't really fit to write these poems. And these poets themselves had to kind of argue with that question. And the poems themselves are arguments. So, for example, two of them are sonnets, so Thesis and Antithesis. With Mahmoud Darwish, he follows the structure of the Arabic qasida to negotiate this position. He begins with a love poem and then realizes that this doesn't fit. We have a nakba. How can I do that? So he had to argue within the poem on how he can extract a subject position in which love and revolution are, in a sense, united. So yes, I'm sorry, there's no easy way to do it. You'll have to keep on reading a lot of texts and poems, and you start making the connections. So, but I mean, you at least begin smartly by pinpointing particular historical moments that can produce these kind of poems, so that you don't read 2,000 years worth of poetry. This answers the question.
What I found fascinating about your thesis is the comparative dimension, not only in the primary sources, the poems that you select, but your theoretical framework. I mean, the reliance on going back to Farabi, Messina, Tajani, in addition to contemporary critics. Could you elaborate on that? Because I found this fascinating, going back to Aristotle, poetics. I was also trying to look for on rhetoric, but it's the way, if you could elaborate on your journey developing this theoretical framework.
Okay, so I began by reading Colors, A Theory of Lyric. And very early on in my research, I knew that I wanted to see, okay, so Color is saying this in Western academia. What about our academia? And when I started to look, again, I didn't get the chance to read everything, but when I started to look at least on the major works that have been produced recently, they're more concerned with particular historical moments in relation to the Arab tradition, rather than an entire theory or a full-rounded theory of poetics or of lyric. So this is one thing that made me look a little bit back. But more importantly, the primary statement of Color and this kind of approach to lyric is that poetry is not mimetic. So it does not try to represent an event, but is itself an event. Now, Color needs to argue for this, because mimesis takes a central role, even with or against, throughout the entire history of Western literary criticism. Now, the reason I went back particularly to the Arabic Islamic philosophers, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and Al-Qartajani, is that because their work is their reception of Aristotle in Arabic. And people say that they miscomprehended it, or that there was a misunderstanding of it. Sure, we can say it though, and so on. I don't really care. What I care is they produced an entirely different approach or an understanding of mimesis or muhakah, or imitation. And when we look at how they, or what did they compare poetry, it wasn't to drama, it wasn't to history, it was to other forms of discourse. So logical discourse, rhetoric, and whatnot. So again, it places poetry in the form of a speech act in our own reality. So I think I was lucky enough, I don't know, to find that particular moment in time where two diverging literary approaches or theoretical approaches merge, and then each of them goes to a separate way. And the reason I went to Arabic theory in the first place is that I felt that many of the questions Western theory of lyric is preoccupied with is absolutely irrelevant. Okay? So it's relevant to their circumstances, they're answering back to their own tradition, but we need to look at other traditions. And more importantly, and Color himself says this in his book, but he doesn't pursue it, he quotes it from Earl Miner. Western theory is based on drama, not poetry. So why not go to a tradition that was actually based on poetry and see what and how they think of poetry? So this answers the question. Thank you.
It's just sort of a comment. I studied under Earl Miner about 3 years before I came here, and he offered a course at Princeton on literary history. And one of the points that he made is that in Eastern literary traditions, in the Far East, if one wrote a poem using the first-person pronoun, it would be assumed that the poet was talking about him or herself. Since New Criticism, that assumption has become impossible. We assume that the poet is using a persona. And in a sense, therefore, the New Criticism derives from Aristotle. And the dominant tradition in Western poetics, beginning with Aristotle, makes it very difficult for us to distinguish lyric from drama. That's where we have a problem. Don't you think that, to turn this into a question, isn't that precisely why it's difficult for people to understand the idea of a poet talking about oppression in a way that implicates him or her in a personal way?
Okay, so part of my research had to look into, again, not just color, but how lyric studies are currently. And for example, there's a huge school in Germany that treats lyric as narrative. Okay. I think I totally understand the point of it being very difficult to distinguish between whether or not the poet is speaking in or her own voice or in a dramatic persona or dramatic fashion. However, I think this preoccupation of the question, and people are still writing on it and they're still publishing on it, and they go into extreme abstractness, 3 levels of reality and non-reality, and within the text and outside the text and whatnot. I applaud the effort, but I think that the question itself isn't that important, because at the end of the day, you have a poem and you have words, and part of my interest in Color's model is that it does not pinpoint the poem to a biographical author or biographical poet, but rather it offers the poem as words that can be reiterated by anyone at any point. So when you do that, you take a poem and you reiterate it as if it's your own words, or in the case of acknowledgement with oppression, you reiterate it to quote from Professor Rafat's poem, to tell the story. And my conclusion in the thesis, I stopped looking at the poems in themselves and I stopped analyzing them, and I started looking at media. So for example, there's a very famous recital of Professor Rifat's poem. Took around, it was done by Brian Cox, and at the time I wrote the thesis, it was 10 million views on Instagram. And what Brian Cox does at the beginning of this recital is that he very explicitly says, a poem by Rifat al-Arabi. And it is also published, I think, on a Palestinian festival or something like that. So it puts the poem in its own context while repeating it. So Brian Cox doesn't take the words to be his, but about an oppressed in Gaza. So I think I understand the impetus behind the philosophical discussions, the ontological position of the speaker and whatnot, but I think it misses a lot that can be unveiled if we direct our attention to other questions. And this is at least what I try to do in the thesis. I'm not sure if I answered the question.
It's a good answer.
Thank you.
I have the mic, so I'm not going to raise my hand. First of all, congrats. You absolutely deserve this, and you have survived it. Congrats on that. And since you have survived it, and it was evidently like a very successful experience, most of us here, like the students, were in very, very early stages. We're not yet to take even the first step. And as you know, I cannot even take that first step. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of like those struggles in the early stages, and sort of like how did you navigate them? Sort of like what kind of mistakes did you do that we should not?
Okay, so I think the first thing that I would like to say is find a question that is important, because there are tons of questions that can produce a lot of research but are ultimately not important. So find something that you to spend time with, to struggle with, and to think that you're doing something meaningful while doing that. That's at least what I try to do. Second thing is to really hold on to your questions and your structure for the thesis early on, very tightly. I mean, Professor Martin sent me a book 2 weeks before I should have submitted my final thesis, and that literally changed my thesis and the title and the structure and everything. I found the words that I needed to kind of, frame my concerns. And that book had been published 2 weeks before he sent it to me. So it was actually published while I was doing my thesis. A very contemporary book of sorts. So I began in a completely different place before I reached to this position. And the only way I could do that is by actually beginning. So I stopped, actually Professor Martin told me, you need to stop reading, you need to stop researching, forget about the proposal, just submit it, and then do the research, do more research. And as I did so, I threw out entire schools of poetry. So part of, one of the chapters would have been on confessional poetry. And I've read Ant Sexton, I've read Sylvia Plath, I've read secondary sources, I've read everything. And then it was all thrown out. I didn't even mention them in the thesis. So this comes through the process itself of writing the thesis, struggling with it, and trying to find answers to the question. And again, this gets us back to the question. You need to find something that you want to research, that you think is important, and to actually do the work, and then the thesis will take you from there. It's literally a storm. You're in a rocking boat, and it takes you wherever it takes you, but at the end of the day, it will calm down, and you'll find new land. So
No, give me another advice. Maybe you're right.
I can't give you another advice. You just need to face the advice. You need to write. No, we're not going to leave academia. Academia is very fun.
Okay, I have a question. First of all, Mahmoud, I'm very, very happy for you. I was wondering, because I think while you're writing your thesis, the genocide in Gaza started to happen, and it took a very long time and it's still happening. So I was thinking, does this genocide affected your writing in any way? Did you have to change something or include something or even change the way you approach the poem?
Okay, so the genocide in Gaza didn't affect my thesis. It affected me as a person. Okay, I started realizing that, okay, there are terrible things, let's put it terrible because I have to be careful with, not to curse or something now. But there are terrible things happening in the world, okay? And I'm studying literature. Now, this is an existential threat to me because either literature is important and it can have an impact and I should pursue my studies, or I'm wasting my time and I should be doing something else that can benefit people in a different way. The genocide started the term in my second term, so I was studying poetry and I was studying philosophy of language, love poetry, the course on love poetry with Professor Martin, and a course on philosophy of language. And I started then to think, for my term papers, what kind of language is poetry in a philosophical way, okay? And I started trying very early on with very little tools. I didn't have enough tools then to think of how can poems have an impact on reality. And that was kind of the impetus behind the whole project. And obviously, I keep on using the poem by Professor Refat because I saw it happening in reality before I understood how it happened. So I didn't look at texts, I didn't look at poetry first. I looked at people and I looked at reality and history, and I tried to explain what was happening. I tried to make sense of why that particular poem went viral. And there's obviously the other option, Baraye, by Hajipur from Iran. After the death of Mahansa Amini and the protests that went, there's this viral song, it went viral, and it follows a very similar structure to Professor Refat's in how people interacted with the poem. So that was the impetus behind the thesis. Again, this project started very theoretically. I was trying to answer impossible questions like, what is poetry and how does poetry function? These are terrible questions because we will never be able to answer them. But then the more I read and the more I researched, the more I saw myself moving towards people rather than towards poetry. And then the idea of community happened, or the idea of a communal lyric poem that addresses you and tries to build an interpersonal relationship with you and then confronts you or invites you or whatnot. So